The arena remained frozen in shocked silence. As the Arbiter's words echoed through the ancient Colosseum, Deho stood over his defeated opponent, the Jingam still in his hands, its blade stained with purple Vrelian blood that was already beginning to dry in the recycled air of the station. Medical drones descended to tend to Torik's wounds, and the young Vrelian was helped to his feet by attendants who could not meet his eyes. The humiliation on his face was more painful to watch than any physical injury. Ambassador Cassith had risen from his seat and was pushing through the crowd toward the arena floor, his forearms moving in agitated patterns that suggested barely controlled fury. The Deshan Arbiter floated between him and the arena, blocking his path. "The contest is complete," the Arbiter said firmly. "Any interference now would violate the compact." "I demand to know what happens next," Cassith said through gritted teeth. "Under the right of answered insult, the victor may claim satisfaction up to and including the life of the offender." The Arbiter replied, "The choice belongs to the human." Every eye in the arena turned to Deho. Billions of beings across the galaxy watched through the news drones that continued to broadcast, waiting to see what the young human would do. Deho looked at Torik, who stood with his head bowed and his wounded arms hanging at his sides. The Vrelian who had spit on his ancestor's sword, who had mocked his people and his culture, who had promised to make him suffer, now waited for judgment with the resignation of one who expected death. For a long moment, Deho said nothing. He thought about his ancestor who had forged this blade. He thought about the generations of his family who had practiced with it and passed down its secrets. He thought about his grandmother who had taught him not just how to fight, but why to fight, and he thought about what his deeds victory truly meant. "My ancestor forged this sword 400 years ago," Deho said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. "He was a warrior who had seen much death, and when he created this blade, he did not make it to take lives. He held up the Jingam so that all could see it. He made it to protect lives, to defend those who could not defend themselves, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them." Deho lowered the sword and looked directly at Torik. "You insulted this blade and everything it represents, but killing you would not restore its honor." He paused to let his words settle over the crowd. "The sword's honor is restored by proving its worth, by showing that a weapon does not need to be advanced to be effective, and that a warrior does not need to kill to be victorious." The arena remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, but the silence of beings who were witnessing something they had not expected. "I formally forgive the insult," Deho announced. "I claim no satisfaction beyond what has already been demonstrated, and I ask only that this sword be returned to my family rather than displayed as a curiosity in a museum." The Arbiter's colors shifted to something that looked like approval. "The terms are acceptable, and the matter is closed under galactic law." A ripple of murmuring passed through the crowd, and Deho heard his translator rendering dozens of different languages, expressing the same basic sentiment of surprise and confusion. Mercy was not something most species understood. Victory without blood was not something they had learned to value. Deho did not care what they thought. He sheathed the Jingam and walked across the sand toward the exit, toward where his grandmother waited for him. She met him at the edge of the arena floor and took his face in her hands, examining his wounds with the practiced eye of someone who had tended many injuries over the years. "You fought well," she said in Korean, "and you showed them something more important than fighting." "I showed them what you taught me," Deho replied. "I showed them what our family has always known." They walked together through the corridors of the station, and Deho noticed that the aliens they passed no longer laughed or pointed. Some of them stepped aside to let them through. A few even bowed their heads in what might have been respect in their quarters. Daho cleaned the sword with the special oil his grandmother had brought from Earth, working the blade until every trace of blood had been removed, and the steel gleamed as it had. For 4 centuries, his grandmother watched him with quiet pride. "Your great-great-grandfather would be pleased," she said, a chime at their door interrupted the moment Daho's grandmother answered it to find Coordinator Yelvith floating in the corridor, her form cycling through colors of formal respect. "I have come to make a request," the Deshan said. "May I enter?" Daho's grandmother stepped aside and the weapons master floated into their quarters, her attention immediately drawn to the sword in Daho's hands. "I have studied combat forms for 700 years," Yelvith said. "I have seen warriors from 100 species and weapons of every imaginable type. And I have never seen anything like what happened in that arena today." She floated closer to Daho. "I formally request permission to study human blade arts, to learn the philosophy behind your techniques, and to add your family's knowledge to my archives so that future generations may benefit from it." Daho looked to his grandmother, who considered the request for a long moment before nodding. "Our family has always believed that knowledge should be shared with those who will use it wisely," she said. "If you wish to learn, you are welcome to learn." Yelva's color shifted to something bright and warm. "Thank you. And know that any species that could produce such weapons and such restraint has been badly misjudged by the galactic community, and I will do what I can to correct that judgment." She departed with promises to return, and Daho and his grandmother were alone again. But not for long. Another chime at the door revealed Ambassador Cassith standing in the corridor, his scales dulled and his posture lacking the arrogant pride that had defined him before. "I request a private audience," he said, "with both of you." They let him enter, and the Vrelian, who had laughed at human culture, stood awkwardly in their small quarters, looking at the sword that had defeated his son. "I have come to apologize," he said, the words clearly difficult for him, not because the law requires it, but because I have spent the past hours reconsidering everything I thought I knew about your species. He looked at Daho with something that might have been respect. "My son trained with the finest weapons masters our credits could buy, used technology that should have made him unbeatable, and was defeated by a child with a piece of old metal." Cassith shook his head. "No, not old metal. And I understand that now." He made a gesture that Daho's translator identified as a formal acknowledgement of error. "Your sword carries 400 years of wisdom, and your body carries 6 generations of dedication. And those things cannot be bought or installed or enhanced." He bowed, a Vrelian gesture of deep respect that Daho had never seen directed at a human before. "I will speak in favor of humanity at the High Council, and I will make sure that my son learns to respect your people as he should have from the beginning." After the ambassador left, Daho sat alone with the sword across his knees. His grandmother had gone to rest, exhausted from the stress of the past week, and the quarters were quiet. Daho spoke softly, his words meant for ears that could not hear them, except perhaps through the steel of the blade. He held, "I hope I have honored you," he said to his ancestors. "I hope you can see what we did today and know that your work was not wasted, that your dedication was not forgotten, that everything you built and passed down still lives." He traced the characters engraved on the blade, the name of his great-great-grandfather who had forged this weapon in a small shop on a peninsula on a small planet that most of the galaxy had never heard of. "They will not laugh at us anymore," Daho promised. "They will remember what a human with a sword can do, and they will think twice before they mock us again." He sheathed the blade and placed it carefully in the case his grandmother had prepared for it, ready to be carried back to Earth where it would rest in their home until the next time it was needed, as he prepared for sleep. Daho thought about the future. He thought about returning to Earth about continuing his training, about becoming worthy of the weapon and the legacy his family had entrusted to him. He thought about the galaxy that had learned a lesson today, and about all the lessons still to come, and he smiled, because he knew that this was only the beginning outside the window of their quarters. The stars of the galaxy burned with ancient light. Somewhere among those stars, beings who had watched the contest were telling others what they had seen. A human child, with an ancient sword, had faced a Vrelian warrior with every advantage and had not only won but had shown mercy and victory. That story would spread, it would grow, and it would change the way the galaxy thought about the small blue planet called Earth and the stubborn, surprising species that called it home. Deho's eyes closed and sleep took him. And in his dreams he walked through a garden on Earth with his grandmother beside him and the sound of steel singing in the wind. The sword had been mocked, the sword had answered, and the galaxy would never forget. The arena of resolution had not seen a true contest of honor in over a century, and the ancient Colosseum was packed with spectators from dozens of species who had traveled from across the galaxy to witness what they believed would be a historic humiliation of humanity. Deho stood at one end of the sand-covered arena floor, the Jingam held in a formal ready position with the blade pointed toward the artificial sky. His grandmother had wrapped his hands in fresh bandages that morning and helped him dress in the simple training clothes their family had used for generations. White fabric with no decoration, no armor. Nothing but the skill of his body to protect him at the other end of the arena. Torix stood in full Vrelian combat regalia, his scaled body covered in lightweight armor that gleamed under the bright lights. In his hand was the energy-enhanced blade his father had provided, a weapon that hummed with power and left trails of light in the air when it moved. Galactic news drones floated above the arena, broadcasting the contest to billions of viewers across known space. The commentators were already narrating what they expected to be a one-sided slaughter. The human child appears calm. But surely that is merely shock, one said. No rational being could face a Vrelian warrior and feel anything but terror. The smart money says this will be over in less than 60 seconds. Another added, our viewers should prepare for content that may be disturbing to species with weak stomachs. Ambassador Cassith sat in a position of honor among the spectators, his forearms crossed over his chest and a smile of anticipation on his scaled face. Near him, in a much less prominent seat, Deho's grandmother watched. With her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. A Veshan arbiter floated to the center of the arena and spoke in a voice amplified to reach every corner of the Colosseum. This contest is held under the right of answered insult, invoked by the human Yun Deho against the Vrelian Torix, son of Ambassador Cassith. The crowd quieted to listen. The contest will end when one combatant yields, is rendered unable to continue, or is killed. The arbiter paused to let those words sink in. There will be no interference from any party under penalty of death, and the outcome will be legally binding under the founding compact of the galactic community. The arbiter floated to the edge of the arena. Combatants, you may begin when you are ready. Torix did not wait. He launched himself across the arena with the enhanced speed his neural implants provided, covering the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. His blade sang through the air in a strike meant to cut Deho in half from shoulder to hip, but Deho was not there. He had begun moving the instant Torix's muscles tensed, reading the Vrelian's body language the way his grandmother had taught him to read any opponent. The Jingam came up in a defensive position that deflected the energy blade just enough to send it past him, and Deho used the momentum to spin away and create distance. The crowd gasped. They had expected the contest to end with that first strike, and instead the human child was still standing, still holding his ancient sword, still very much alive. Lucky, one of the commentators said. Though his voice sounded less certain than before, the human was simply lucky. Toryx snarled and attacked again. This time, with a flurry of strikes that came from every angle. His enhanced speed made his blade blur into a wall of light. And any one of those strikes would have been fatal if it connected. Deho retreated across the sand, blocking and deflecting and occasionally ducking beneath attacks that passed over his head, close enough to singe his hair. He took cuts on his arms and legs, shallow wounds that bled freely but did not slow him down. The crowd began to murmur. This was not the quick execution they had expected. The human was losing, certainly being driven back with each exchange. But he was not breaking. He was not falling. Fight back, Toryx screamed in frustration, pausing his assault. Stop running like the coward you are. Deho stood with blood dripping from half a dozen wounds, his breath coming hard but his eyes clear. I am not running, he said. I am learning. He had been watching Toryx's patterns, studying the way the Vrelian moved, cataloging every tendency and habit the same way his grandmother had taught him to study any opponent. Toryx relied on his speed and his enhanced blade to overwhelm his enemies. He attacked with power, but not with precision. He had never faced someone who could survive long enough to learn his weaknesses, because everyone he had ever fought had died too. Quickly, you are learning to die. Toryx spat. He charged again, his blade aimed directly at Deho's heart. This time, Deho did not retreat. He stepped forward into the attack, into the exact space where Toryx's blade would pass. And in the same motion, he pivoted his body by a degree so narrow that the energy blade missed him by the width of a hair. The Jingam came up in the counter-strike his grandmother had shown him on the third day of training. A movement that looked simple, but contained generations of refinement. The ancient steel met Toryx's extended arm just above the wrist. The Vrelian's expensive armor could stop energy weapons and plasma fire, but it had not been designed to stop a blade moving with perfect technique, striking at the precise angle where protection was weakest. Toryx screamed as the Jingam cut through scale and muscle and nerve. His grip failed and his weapon flew from his hand to land in the sand several meters away. The arena fell. Absolutely silent, Deho stepped back and returned to his ready position. The Jingam now stained with purple Vrelian blood. Toryx stared at his injured arm, at the wound that would heal but would leave a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. You cut me, he said in disbelief. You actually cut me. The fight does not have to continue, Deho said calmly. You can yield, and this will be over. Rage twisted Toryx's face into something ugly, even by Vrelian standards. He bent and scooped up his fallen blade with his other hand, the one that had not been injured. I will not yield to a primitive ape with a piece of sharpened metal. He roared. He attacked again, but now his movements were wild, driven by fury rather than training. He swung his blade in massive arcs that would have cut Deho apart if they connected, but that left enormous openings between. Each strike, Deho weighted his grandmother's voice echoed in his memory from 100 training sessions. Patience is the greatest weapon, and anger is the greatest weakness, so let your enemy defeat himself while you simply guide his fall. Toryx committed to a massive overhead strike that would have split Deho from crown to groin. It was exactly the attack his grandmother had prepared him for on the fifth day. Deho stepped to the side and let the blade pass. Then he moved. The Jingam traced a path through the air that his ancestor had designed 4 centuries ago. A combination of movements that flowed together like water, each one setting up the next. The first cut opened a gash across Toryx's chest, too shallow to kill but deep enough to spray blood across the sand. The second struck his other wrist, numbing the hand and loosening his grip on the energy blade. The third, the final movement of the combination, stopped with the tip of the Jingam pressed against Toryx's throat. The arena was so quiet that Deho could hear his own heartbeat. Torek stood frozen, his eyes wide, his chest heaving, blood flowing from wounds that would scar him for life. His blade had fallen from his weakened grip. He was unarmed. He was defeated. Yield. Deho said. Tarek's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked toward his father in the stands. But Ambassador Casteth had turned away, unable to watch his son's humiliation. Yield. Deho said again. Tarek closed his eyes and let out a sound that might have been a sob. I yield, he whispered. The arbiter floated forward. The contest is decided, the Veshan announced. The human Yun Deho is victorious. The silence continued for another heartbeat. And then the arena erupted in noise that Deho could not interpret. He did not care about the noise. He lowered his sword and looked up to find his grandmother in the stands. And he saw that she was smiling through her tears. That was all the victory he needed. The training facility on the lower levels of Vexor 7 had been designed for species much larger than humans. And Deho felt like a small fish in an ocean of giants as he practiced his forms each morning. His grandmother had secured the space through her diplomatic connections. Though the cost had been favors, she would be paying back for years. It did not matter. What mattered was the sword. The museum had released the Jingam to him on the second day, acknowledging that the right of answered insult gave him the right to wield it in combat. When Deho first held the weapon his ancestor had forged 4 centuries ago, he felt something move through him like electricity. The blade was lighter than he expected, but perfectly balanced. And the handle fit his hands as if it had been made for him specifically. His grandmother watched him hold the sword, and her eyes grew wet with tears. She quickly wiped away. Your great-great-grandfather would be proud, she said. Now show me the first form. Deho moved through the patterns she had taught him since he was 6 years old. The simple cuts and blocks that formed the foundation of their family art. But now his grandmother corrected him constantly, adjusting his grip by millimeters, changing the angle of his feet by degrees, teaching him refinements that she said she had been saving for when he was old enough to understand. Why did you wait? He asked during a rest period on the third day. Because these techniques are dangerous, she replied. Not just to your opponent, but to yourself. And a young mind might use them carelessly. She demonstrated a movement that looked like a simple defensive posture, but contained within it the potential for a devastating counterstrike. Your great-great-grandfather developed these forms after studying 30 years of actual combat, and each one is designed to defeat a specific type of attack. How do I know which one to use? Deho asked. You will feel it, his grandmother said. When your opponent commits to their strike, your body will know what to do because we have trained it to know. Word of the upcoming contest had spread across the galactic networks, and it seemed like half the station had come to watch Deho train. Most of them watched from the observation galleries above the training floor, their faces showing various degrees of amusement and pity. A human child fighting a Vrelian was not a contest. It was an execution. Deho tried to ignore them, but it was difficult when their laughter filtered down to where he practiced on the 4th day. News arrived about Torek's preparations. The young Vrelian had been fitted with a ceremonial blade from his homeworld, a weapon that pulsed with energy enhancement technology that made it cut through almost anything. The blade was legal under the contest rules because it was a traditional Vrelian weapon, just as Deho's sword was a traditional human weapon. The difference was that Vrelian tradition had always included advanced technology, while human tradition had not. It is not fair, Deho said that night as he sat with his grandmother in their quarters. Their sword is better than mine. Life is not fair, his grandmother replied, but the sword is not what wins a fight. She tapped his forehead with one finger. This is what wins a fight. And this, She tapped his chest over his heart. Technology makes warriors lazy. And Torek has been lazy his entire life, while you have been training since before you could read. On the 5th day, a visitor came to the training facility. She was a Theshan, one of the floating beings of light and gas. And she identified herself as Coordinator Yelvith, a weapons master who had spent centuries studying combat forms across dozens of species. I have come to observe the human, she announced. And Deho's grandmother allowed her to stay because Theshans were known for their neutrality. Yelvith watched Deho practice for hours without saying anything, her form shifting through colors that his translator could not interpret. Finally, as the training session ended, she approached him. "You move differently than I expected," she said in her wind chime voice. "Most species fight to kill as quickly as possible, but your movements suggest a different philosophy. My grandmother says the sword is not meant to take life." Deho replied, "It is meant to protect life. And sometimes protecting life means defeating an enemy without killing them." Yelvith's colors shifted to something that might have been surprise. "I have studied human combat history," she admitted. "It is fascinating that your species, alone among all others, refined killing arts to such philosophical levels." She floated closer, and Deho could feel the warmth of her form like standing near a gentle fire. "I must warn you about something," she said quietly so that only he could hear. "Torek has neural-enhanced reflexes installed 2 days ago, and he now moves 3 times faster than a natural Relian, and his reach is nearly twice yours, even without that advantage." Deho felt fear grip his stomach, but he kept his face calm. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am curious," Yelvith replied. "I want to see if human philosophy can defeat Relian technology, and I cannot see that if you are dead before the fight truly begins." She began to float away, then paused. "One more thing, young human. Yes, I have watched Tarek train as well, and he fights like someone who has never faced an opponent who might actually hurt him." She drifted toward the exit. "That is both his strength and his weakness. If you were wise enough to understand what I mean." Deho thought about her words all through the 6th day, as he trained harder than he had ever trained before. His muscles screamed, and his hands bled through the bandages his grandmother wrapped around them each morning. But he did not stop. He could not stop on the night before the contest. His grandmother sat with him, and they ate a meal of Korean food she had brought from Earth, preserved and heated in the small kitchen of their quarters. "I remember when your father first held a practice sword," she said. "He was 4 years old and so excited that he kept swinging it at everything in the house." Deho smiled at the image. What happened to him? He grew up and decided that the way of the sword was not for him. His grandmother said, without judgment, "He became an engineer instead and married your mother and had you." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I thought perhaps our family's art would end with me. But then you were born, and I saw the way you looked at the practice swords on the wall. I always wanted to learn," Deho admitted. "From my first memory, I wanted to learn." His grandmother squeezed his hand. "Tomorrow you will face an enemy faster and stronger than you, with a weapon more advanced than yours, in front of a galaxy that expects you to fail." She stood and retrieved the jingam from its resting place, holding it out to him with both hands in the formal presentation their ancestors had used for generations. "But you carry 400 years of wisdom in this blade, and 6 generations of our family's dedication in your body, and something that no Vrelian has ever had to develop. What is that?" Deho asked as he accepted the sword. His grandmother smiled, and in that smile, he saw the fierce warrior she must have been in her youth. "The ability to surprise those who underestimate you." She bowed to him, student to student, and he bowed back. "Rest now," she said. "Tomorrow we show the galaxy what humans are made of." Deho lay in his bed that night with the sword beside him. His hand resting on the ancient handle, he thought about his ancestor who had forged this blade. He thought about the generations who had practiced with it. He thought about his grandmother who had taught him everything she knew, and he thought about Torek, who would spit on all of that without a second thought. Sleep came slowly, but when it came, Deho dreamed of victory. The Hall of Grievances was the oldest structure on Vexor 7, built in an age when the galactic community was young, and species still settled their disputes with blood rather than bureaucracy. Its walls were carved from asteroid stone that had been hauled across light years, and its ceiling arched so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it during the wet season of the station's climate cycle. Deho stood at the entrance to this ancient hall with his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had left his grandmother's quarters before she woke, leaving only a short note that said he had something important to do and that she should not worry. He knew she would worry anyway, and he felt guilty for causing her pain, but he also knew that if he told her what he planned, she would stop him. The guards at the entrance were Theshans, floating beings made of light and gas who served as neutral arbiters for the station, and they examined his request for entry with what seemed like genuine curiosity. A human wishes to invoke the old laws, one of them said in a voice like wind chimes. This has not happened in our memory. The laws are still valid, Deho replied, keeping his voice steady, even though his legs felt weak beneath him. I have the right to be heard. The Theshans conferred in their own language of shifting colors and tones, and then parted to let him through. You may enter, young human, but know that what you begin here cannot be easily undone. Deho nodded and walked into the hall, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The chamber was arranged like an amphitheater, with seats rising in circles around a central platform where petitioners made their cases before the Council of Arbitration. At this early hour, only a few council members were present, alien bureaucrats who handled the minor disputes that did not require the full assembly. They looked up with mild interest as Deho approached the platform, and their interest sharpened considerably when they realized what species he belonged to. State your business. Human, said a Corellian judge, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence as she studied him. Deho took a deep breath and spoke the words he had memorized during his sleepless night. I invoke the right of answered insult under Section 7 of the Founding Compact, which grants any sentient being the right to demand satisfaction when their cultural artifacts are deliberately dishonored by a member of another species. Silence fell over the hall. The council members exchanged looks of disbelief, and then one of them began to laugh. A harsh croaking sound that echoed off the ancient stones. The right of answered insult. The Corellian judge repeated slowly. That law has not been invoked in 300 standard years, but it remains valid, Deho said, pulling a datapad from his pocket and holding it up. I have reviewed the legal archives and found no record of its repeal or amendment, and the Founding Compact clearly states that any law not explicitly revoked remains in full force. The judges conferred among themselves in hurried whispers, and Deho saw several of them accessing legal databases on their own devices, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty to something that looked almost like concern. The human is correct. One of them finally admitted, the right remains valid law. Then you must hear my petition, Deho said. And now his voice came out stronger because he knew he had them. Yesterday, in the Museum of Primitive Cultures, an artifact sacred to my family and my people was deliberately desecrated by one named Tarek, son of Ambassador Kasseth of the Vrelian hegemony. He described what had happened, leaving out no detail of the cracked glass and the spit and the laughter of the crowd. I named Tarek as the offender, and I demand satisfaction according to the ancient law. Word of what was happening had spread quickly through the station, and the hall was beginning to fill with curious onlookers who had heard that something unusual was taking place among them. Deho spotted the distinctive scales of Relian observers, and he knew it would not be long before Ambassador Cassith himself arrived. The council had no choice but to proceed. They summoned Torek formally, and within the hour, the young Vrelian stood across from Deho on the platform, his father beside him and a crowd of hundreds watching. From the rising seats, Ambassador Cassith's face showed amusement rather than worry. This is what humanity sends to challenge. My son, he announced loudly enough for all to hear, a child barely old enough to walk. Invoking law is meant for warriors and statesmen. The law makes no mention of age requirements. Deho replied calmly, only that the offended party must be sentient and capable of speech. And I am both. Laughter rippled through the Vrelian section of the audience. But the council members did not join in. The human speaks truly. The Corellian judge confirmed, under the right of answered insult. The offended party chooses the nature of the contest by which satisfaction will be determined, and the offender must accept or forfeit and face the traditional penalties of shame and exile. Ambassador Cassith's amusement flickered for just a moment before returning in full force. Very well, he said with a dismissive wave. Let the human child name his contest so that my son can crush him, and we can all return to more important matters. Deho had thought long and hard about this moment during his sleepless night, and he knew exactly what he would say. The insult was given to a sword, he declared. So the satisfaction shall be claimed with a sword. He paused to let his words sink in. I choose blade combat as the contest, and I choose to fight with the very weapon that was mocked and dishonored. The hall erupted in noise as aliens of every species began talking at once. Some laughed at the absurdity of a human child challenging a Vrelian to combat. Others debated the legal implications of using a museum artifact as a weapon. A few, very few, looked at Deho with something that might have been respect. Ambassador Cassith silenced his section of the audience with a raised hand. My son accepts, he announced, unable to hide his glee. This will be a lesson to all humans about the consequences of reaching beyond their station. Torek bared his teeth in what passed for a Vrelian smile. I will try not to kill you too quickly. Little human, he said, I want the galaxy to see you suffer first. Deho met his gaze without flinching. I look forward to educating you about what human weapons can do. The council set the contest for 7 station days, giving both parties time to prepare. As the hall began to empty and the news spread across the galactic networks, Deho finally allowed himself to feel the fear he had been holding back. He had challenged a Vrelian to combat. Vrelians were faster, stronger, and more experienced in violence than any human could. Hope to be Torek was probably already training with the finest weapons masters his father's money could buy, and Deho was just a boy who had learned swordplay from his grandmother in the garden behind their house on Earth. A hand gripped his shoulder, and he turned to find his grandmother standing behind him, her face a mixture of emotions he could not fully read. You foolish, brave, impossible boy, she said in Korean. What have you done? I have done what our ancestors would have wanted, Deho replied. I have answered the insult. His grandmother closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Then we have 7 days to make sure you survive it, she said, and when she opened her eyes again, they held a fire that Deho had never seen before. Come with me now and do not speak to anyone on the way. She led him through the station to a storage facility where human diplomatic cargo was kept. And there she opened a case that Deho had not known she brought inside. Lay 2 wooden practice swords and a set of training clothes that smelled of earth and home. Your great-great-grandfather forged that sword, she said as she handed him one of the wooden blades. And he also created the art of wielding it. She took the other practice sword and settled into a stance that Daeho recognized from years of training. For 6 generations, our family has passed down his techniques. And now you will learn what I have been saving for the day you were truly ready. She moved faster than Daeho had ever seen her move. And the wooden blade came within an inch of his face before stopping. Lesson 1. She said with a grim smile. Everything I taught you before was just the beginning. The Galactic Museum of Primitive Cultures stood at the heart of Vexera 7, a massive station that floated between 3 star systems and served as neutral ground for dozens of species who could not stand to breathe the same air on any planet they called home, Yoon. Daeho walked through the gleaming halls beside his grandmother, his eyes moving from display to display as aliens of every shape and size pointed at artifacts behind glass and made sounds that his translator rendered as laughter. He was 14 years old, and this was his first trip beyond Earth, a reward for his excellent marks in school, and also because his grandmother needed company on her long journey to represent human culture at the annual Galactic Heritage Conference. His grandmother, Yoon Seon-hee, wore traditional Korean clothing that drew stares from the aliens they passed. Though whether those stares held curiosity or contempt, Daeho could not tell. She walked with her back straight and her chin high, and Daeho tried to copy her posture, even as his stomach twisted with nerves. The museum had a special wing dedicated to Earth artifacts, and this was where his grandmother was leading him. Though her steps had grown slower the closer they came to it, when they finally entered the wing, Daeho understood why a crowd of aliens had gathered around the central display case, and the sounds coming from them needed no translation. They were laughing at what they saw inside. Daeho pushed through the crowd, his small human frame slipping between the massive bodies of Relians and the floating forms of Deshans until he reached the front, and could see what had drawn such mockery. Behind the glass lay a sword. It was a jingam, a traditional Korean straight sword with a handle wrapped in rayskin and silk cord, its blade showing the marks of 400 years of careful maintenance. A small placard beside it explained that the sword had been donated by the Yoon family of Korea as part of Earth's cultural exchange program. One of the Vrelians, a towering creature covered in iridescent scales with 4 arms and a face that seemed designed to express disdain, leaned close to the glass and let out a barking laugh. "This is what humans considered a weapon," he announced to the crowd, his voice booming through the chamber. Sharpened metal on a stick, while the rest of the galaxy had plasma rifles for 10,000 years. The aliens around him laughed harder, and several made gestures that Daeho's translator helpfully identified as the equivalent of pointing and mocking. Perhaps they used it to cut their food, another alien suggested, and this brought a fresh wave of amusement. No wonder they took so long to reach the stars, the first Vrelian continued. And Daeho saw from the ornate clothing he wore that this was no common tourist, but someone important. They were too busy playing with sharp sticks to develop real technology. A hand touched Daeho's shoulder, and he looked up to find his grandmother beside him, her face carefully blank in a way that told him she was controlling great emotion. "Come away," she said softly, her Korean words not picked up by the public translators. "There is nothing to be gained here." "Grandmother," Daeho whispered back. "That sword." "I know," she said, and now he could hear the pain beneath her controlled tone. "Your great-great-grandfather forged that blade with his own hands, and our family practiced its art for 6 generations before we gave it up so that Earth might have something to offer the galaxy." Daeho felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "They are laughing at our ancestors." "Yes," his grandmother agreed. "And they will keep laughing because Earth is new to the galactic community and we have no power to make them stop. So we must endure and prove our worth in other ways over time." The important Vrelian had moved on to examining other human artifacts, dismissing each one with cutting remarks. that made his audience of followers chuckle and nod. Stone tools, cloth clothing, wooden ships, he listed with theatrical disgust. And they wonder why we hesitate to give them a seat on the High Council. He turned to face the crowd, spreading all four of his arms wide. I am Ambassador Cassith of the Vrelian hegemony, and I have seen enough today to confirm what I have always believed about these humans. His eyes, three of them arranged in a triangle on his scaled face, swept across the room and landed on Deho and his grandmother. They are barely evolved apes playing at civilization. And that sword is all the proof anyone should need. Deho felt his grandmother's grip tighten on his shoulder, a warning to stay silent. And he obeyed even as his blood burned with shame and anger. A younger Vrelian pushed through the crowd to stand beside Ambassador Cassith. And the resemblance between them was clear enough that Deho knew this must be his son, father. The young Vrelian said with a sneer that showed rows of sharp teeth. May I examine the primitive weapon more closely? Of course. Torek, the ambassador said with an indulgent wave. Perhaps you can determine if it was also used as a cooking utensil. The crowd laughed again as Torek approached the display case. And Deho watched with growing dread as the young alien circled the glass with predatory interest. What happened next occurred so quickly that Deho almost missed it. Torek raised one clawed hand and brought it down hard against the corner of the display case, cracking the glass with a sharp sound that echoed through the chamber. Then, before anyone could react, he reached through the crack and pulled out the ancient sword. Holding it up for all to see, how light, he announced with contempt. How fragile and worthless. He held the blade over the cracked display case and let a thick glob of saliva fall from his mouth onto the polished steel. That is what I think of human culture, he declared, and dropped the sword back into the case as if it were garbage. The aliens around him roared with approval while station security guards stood at the edges of the crowd and did nothing at all. Deho felt tears burning in his eyes. But he refused to let them fall in front of these creatures who had just desecrated something sacred to his family and his people. His grandmother pulled him away from the display and toward the exit. And he went without resistance because he knew that fighting would only make things worse for Earth and for her position. But as they walked through the gleaming halls of the station that suddenly seemed cold and hostile, Deho made a silent promise to himself and to the spirits of his ancestors. He would not let this insult stand. He did not know how, and he did not know when. But somehow he would make them understand that the sword they mocked was not a primitive toy but a piece of living history forged with skill and dedication that these aliens could never comprehend. His grandmother said nothing as they returned to their quarters. But when they were finally alone behind closed doors, she did something that surprised him. She knelt before the small shrine she had brought from Earth and lit a stick of incense. And Deho heard her whisper words of apology to their ancestors for failing to protect what had been entrusted to the galaxy's care. Deho knelt beside her and added his own whispered words, though his were not apologies, but promises. The night cycle of the station came and went. But Deho did not sleep. He sat before his personal terminal and searched through files of galactic law, reading document after document until his eyes ached and his mind grew fuzzy with exhaustion. And then, just as the station's lights began to brighten for the morning cycle, he found what he was looking for. A law so old that most species had forgotten it existed. A law that could change everything.